Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Anne-Sophie Corbeau. I am a global research scholar here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Today, we are going to discuss the latest edition of the IEA's gas market report. I think we all know about the current situation here in Europe, so I cannot stress enough how much awaited this report is. So let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And as a reminder, our events are now closed caption, so you can turn the captions on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting Show Subtitle. I am really delighted to be joined by three excellent panelists today. First of all, my very good friend, Akos Loss, who is an energy analyst at the International Energy Agency, working where I was working kind of a decade ago. And he's going to present the main conclusions of the IEA's report. But we have also with us Tom Marsek-Menser, who is the head of gas analytics at ICIS, as well as Leslie Palti-Guzman, who is CEO and co-founder of Gas Vista. So really an excellent panel that we have today. But without waiting too much, I really want to give the floor to Akos because we really want to know what he's going to tell us about the short and medium-term future for the gas market. Akos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. Let me first share my screen. Okay, it's visible. All right. So thank you once again. It's great to be back at Columbia. And special thanks to you, Anne-Sophie and Leslie, for doing this webinar on Bastille Day, which is the most important national holiday, of course, in France. I'm certainly very honored that you both choose to discuss the IEA's latest gas market outlook rather than celebrating French Revolution somewhere on a nice beach. So happy Bastille Day to both of you, and thanks very much for being here today. When it comes to the global gas market, this is certainly not the time for relaxation either. In fact, if you look at this first slide, you can see that the market has been in a more or less permanent state of crisis since the second half of last year. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is this dotted line here in February, has only added fuel to the fire when it comes to price spikes and volatility. We hit an all-time high for prices in both Europe and Asia in early March when the EU Commission first decided that it wants to end all fossil fuel imports from Russia well before 2030. But after that, as you can see, we actually had a pretty calm period in April and May when the weather was mild, Asian demand was weak, and LNG inflows to Europe were actually pretty strong. So despite all the geopolitical wrangling, European storage levels were actually building up to a fairly comfortable level at this time of the year. But of course, spot prices in Europe and Asia started to spike again in the last few weeks. And if we move to the next slide, you can see that apart from an outage at the Freeport LNG plant in Texas, the main concern, of course, is the sharp reduction of Russian pipeline gas flows to Europe since the beginning of May. Again, as you can see, first stage of the conflict was until about April. The actual physical flows from Russia were relatively high and stable until about the end of April. But the cracks started to appear in early May when Russia started to cut off companies and countries that refused to pay it in rubles. And it effectively arbitrarily terminated more than 25 BCM of contracts with 6 of its European buyers back then. And then in May, Russia also imposed its own set of sanctions on several European companies, mostly its own subsidiaries and joint ventures, which were previously trading and importing gas into Europe. And it also sanctioned the owner of the Polish section of the Yamal pipeline, which effectively meant the shutdown of this transit route for the time being. As you can see, the disappearance of this light green bar shows the complete stop of Yamal flows from mid-May. And then the Ukrainian flows were also hit. This was because the Ukrainian TSO declared force majeure in one of the 2 main entry points for Russian gas to Ukraine due to the ongoing fighting in the area. And Gazprom simply refused to redirect flows to a functional transit route. And of course, the biggest shock came in mid-June when flows on the Nord Stream 1 line to Germany were cut back by about 60%, allegedly for technical reasons. And as we all know, 3 days ago, this pipeline was completely shut down for regular maintenance. Of course, in normal times, this would not make the headlines. Maintenance is done every year for about 10 to 12 days. But these are anything but normal times, and many analysts and government officials now expect, or at least worried, that Gazprom may not restart the pipeline at all, especially if the Russian government decides to further weaponize gas flows to Europe ahead of the heating season, which seems to be a pattern that has been followed in recent weeks. So we move on to the next slide. As a result of all these supply cuts, we now expect the share of Russian gas in the European supply mix to decline from about 40% last year to around 25% this year. And this picture shows both the determination and also the difficulty of phasing out Russian gas from the European mix. On the one hand, we are on track to reverse about a decade of growing dependence in a single year, which never really happened before, certainly not after the previous gas crisis in 2006 or 2009, and even less so after the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. As you can see, our dependence on Russian gas has only increased since then. On the other hand, we are still going to be almost as dependent on Russian gas this year as we were a decade ago. This comes after a year of already very painful economic sanctions, arbitrary cuts by Russia here and there, and a flurry of energy diplomacy and record high LNG prices to attract alternative supplies to Europe. And of course, going from 40 to 25 is going to be painful this year, then going from 25 to 0 in later years will be even more so in the years ahead. So, and that especially applies if this is done in a disorderly fashion, as seems quite possible right now. So one of the most important consequences of this decline in Russian pipe flows to Europe has been the complete reconfiguration of LNG trade globally. For the time being, Europe is the undisputed premium market for LNG. And as you can see, in the first half of 2022, European LNG imports increased by more than 50% compared to last year. But global LNG supply only increased by about 5% in the same period. So most of this incremental LNG to Europe had to be thrown away from somewhere else, and that somewhere else was mostly from Asia. And the biggest declines here took place in China, where imports dropped by more than 20% year over year in the first half of the year, and also in India, where imports were down by 14% in the first half. And on the supply side, on the right-hand chart, you can see that about 2/3 of the increase in global LNG trade came from the US alone. And actually, both of these dynamics, the dominance of Europe in the demand side and also the dominance of the US on the supply side, raise some uncomfortable questions, I would say, for the second half of the year. Europe's LNG requirements will probably only increase, especially if there is a further reduction in Russian pipeline gas flows in the months ahead. But it is not at all assured that that Asian demand will stay weak as it was in the first half, especially if the Chinese economy rebounds strongly after their COVID-related lockdowns, or there is a heat wave or a cold spell in Northeast Asia, for example. And on the supply side, the outage of Freeport has already shown us how vulnerable we all are to unexpected outages and LNG supply disruptions in this very tight market environment. And we can certainly have more such disruptions in the second half of the year. Just one of the many risk factors is the stronger than average hurricane season that the US National Weather Service is now expecting for this year. So they're forecasting up to 10 hurricanes, and of that, up to 6 major hurricanes in this season. We had 7 and 4 of those respectively last year. So one thing certainly to watch is the hurricane season in the Gulf Coast this time of the year. And of course, this extreme market tightness and the high price environment that we have after the invasion of Ukraine is also detrimental to global gas demand, both in the near term and also in the medium term. Now, for this year, at the beginning of the year, our initial demand forecast was a 1% increase globally, which was already relatively modest compared to the 4.5% jump we had last year. But we had to cut this forecast back even further after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and our current expectation is actually for a 0.5% drop in global gas consumption this year. So we made a roughly 60 BCM cut to global gas demand overall, mainly in response to the high price environment that we have after the invasion. And the biggest part of this downward revision obviously comes from Asia and Europe, where high gas prices, looming shortages, weaker economic activity, and also the COVID-related lockdowns in China specifically lead to the biggest erosion of demand. And if you look at this next slide, you can also see that we also made cuts to the medium-term demand forecast for 2023 and onwards. So in the previous year's outlook, we projected a global gas demand increase of about 210 BCM for the 2021 to 2024 period. This year's outlook, we only expect about 75 BCM for the same period. So this means that we reduced our medium-term growth projection by nearly 2/3 from a year ago. And unfortunately, this very sizable downward revision of demand does not necessarily mean that we are moving closer to a faster energy transition to net zero. In fact, as you can see on my chart here, about 80% of the downgrade is either due to lower economic activity or lower coal to gas and oil to gas switching, as this high price environment delays the conversion plans in many parts of the world. And only about 1/5 of the demand reduction actually comes from improved efficiency or the substitution of gas with cleaner fuels. In terms of geography, mature gas markets account for just over half of the downward revision, and Europe is taking the largest cut. But the other half of the adjustment comes from emerging economies, especially as an unintended consequence of the European energy crisis and the associated price increases. So if you look at this from a climate change and energy equity perspective, it would actually make a lot of sense to use this crisis in mature economies and accelerate the transition away from gas cut demand, because this could not only ease the global price competition, but also free up more gas for price-sensitive emerging markets, where gas can actually still deliver short-term climate benefits and accelerate the transition away from dirtier fuels, especially from coal. Now, this downgraded demand outlook that we have in this year's outlook also does not mean that the global LNG market tightness will ease anytime soon. And this is because we have entered the structurally slower period of liquefaction capacity addition since last year. So in the 5 years leading up to 2020, the average rate of new LNG capacity additions was about 40 BCM per year. However, in the period between 2021 and 2025, we only are going to see about half as much capacity added each year. And this slowdown, of course, is further exacerbated by the uncertain completion timeline for the Arctic LNG 2 project in Russia in particular, which is now subject to Western sanctions. Previously, this was going to be the biggest component of global LNG supply growth, at least this side of 2025, but we no longer expect that the second and the third trains will be completed in the foreseeable future. Now, the industry is actually already responding to this tightness, and we can argue that the next LNG investment cycle has already started and it's already underway. These projects, of course, typically take 3 to 5 years to complete, so any FID that is taken today will only bring relief after 2025. But we do note in our report that the prospects for additional project approvals are very strong indeed. We have high and volatile spot LNG prices. We have forward curves that put both oil-linked and Henry Hub-linked LNG significantly below spot price levels. And we have also very strong focus on gas supply security, both in Europe and Asia. And all of these create a very favorable environment for additional final investment decisions. And in addition to this, as you can see on the right-hand chart, we are seeing a very strong increase in LNG contracting activity since the beginning of 2021. There was about 140 BCM of new LNG contracts signed. And if we break this down a little bit, we see that almost 90% of this volume was 10 years or longer duration, so very much bankable in the project financing market, and also more than 45%, so almost a half, was signed with pre-FID projects. So about a half of these contracts can actually help underpin new capacity in the market. But these favorable signals have actually yet to translate to more project approvals. We had only 2 formal final investment decisions so far in 2022, the first phase of the Plaquemines project in Louisiana and the Corpus Christi Stage 3 project in Texas. But we definitely think there is more to come. One interesting aspect of this is that so far it was mainly Asian buyers who went out and secured additional LNG volumes. You can see this on the right-hand chart again, the right column. And European buyers are actually still quite reluctant, with a few exceptions, to sign new long-term contracts. And without new contracts for Europe, of course, the competition with Asia for flexible LNG volumes will have to continue. And our latest LNG forecast indicates that this competition will probably stay very strong in the foreseeable future. We project that Europe and not Asia will be the main engine of LNG demand growth between 2021 and 2025. And according to our latest numbers, Europe alone will account for about 60% of the net global growth in LNG imports during this period. But of course, LNG is only one tool in the box when it comes to phasing out Russian pipeline gas from Europe, or Russian gas overall from the European energy mix. And if the European Union wants to go much further than where we are today, then it has to go beyond just looking at LNG. So this graph is showing our baseline assumptions that actually went into our forecast. And you can see that LNG is indeed the biggest diversification lever available to Europe, but an almost equally large part could come from gas demand reduction measures, like an accelerated rollout of renewables, more energy efficiency investments, and also more rapid deployment of heat pumps. Now, pipeline suppliers, we can also expect some additional supply from them, about 20 BCM towards the reduction of Russian pipeline gas flows. And there is some limited potential for low carbon gases, but you can see that their potential to contribute to this in this limited 2025 time frame is actually quite small. But with all these measures and some offsetting increases in EU import requirements, the volume of Russian gas imports into the EU would actually drop by half between 2021 and 2025. And with this, we estimate that the share of Russian gas in the EU demand mix would be around 20% in 2025, at least in our base case. We also developed an accelerated case for phasing out Russian gas, and we look specifically at measures that would not require even higher LNG imports, because we think that would tighten the global gas market even further and boost Russia's hub-linked revenues on its remaining sales to Europe, which is certainly not a desirable objective in this current context. And what we found here is that the EU can cut back its Russian gas imports to as low as 30 BCM, or about 10% of total demand by 2025. And this will be possible with an even more aggressive cut in demand, which could come from additional heat pump deployment, more energy efficiency, and also some behavioral changes like turning down the thermostat. And this can be, of course, supplemented by an all-out deployment of biomethane and hydrogen. Potential here is still relatively small, but more material if there is significant support behind this. And also, Europe can consider rerouting Russian LNG shipments to Asia, which would be problematic from a logistical perspective, but that's also a sizable lever to reduce Russian flows into Europe. Now, if we go down this accelerated pathway, then the EU will be on track for a complete phase out of Russian gas by 2027, which is the stated objective in the REPower EU plan. So with these additional measures, it's actually possible to phase out Russian gas completely by 2027 in an orderly fashion. And in this next slide, we can see this perhaps less widely discussed aspect of this breakup between Russia and the West, and that is how Russian upstream and Russian production is impacted. And the picture is not pretty at all. We estimate in our report that the combined effect of the Western sanctions and the EU's decision to phase out Russian gas could lead to a cumulative production loss of about 480 BCM in the 2022 and 2025 period, compared with our previous medium-term forecast. And this number is consistent with the base case on my previous slide. If we follow the accelerated phase-out trajectory to the EU, then the cumulative production loss in the next 4 years could be as high as 550 BCM. And of course, the worst hit projects would be those that were previously dedicated to various export schemes, especially in Western Siberia and in the Yamal Peninsula. And I should note that these numbers are absolutely staggering. To put this in context, in the best 4-year period for US gas production during the peak of the shale gas boom, we had a cumulative increase of just under 200 BCM. And here we're talking about potentially losing more than 2.5 times as much in the span of the next 4 years, which would certainly qualify as one of the biggest supply shocks in gas market history. Now, Russia will most likely try to redirect some of its European exports to the east, but we did some analysis around that and we concluded that this pivot to Asia is actually difficult, time-consuming and quite expensive. Our analysis shows that even in a best case scenario for Russia, it would take at least a decade to ramp up gas supplies and approach a level that is comparable to Russia's gas exports to the EU in 2021. With existing and soon to be completed infrastructure, this volume of Russian gas exports to Asia could plausibly increase from around 30 BCM last year to around 80 BCM by 2025. But as you can see here in the far right, going beyond this level would require new additional export infrastructure, significant capital investments, additional commitments from Chinese buyers, and in the case of Arctic LNG, to also Western technologies that are currently restricted by sanctions. So I think I stop here. I hope this gives us enough to discuss in the next half hour or so. In the interest of time, I will not go through these takeaways once again, but I look very much forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention. And Sophie, back to you.
Thank you very much, Akosh. Indeed, I mean, I'm sure we are going to have a passionate discussion, but first of all, I would like to turn to Tom for some comments on what we have just seen. I mean, Tom, I know you are posting pretty much every day on LinkedIn about what is happening on European gas market. So what are your thoughts?
Well, actually, firstly, thank you to you and Sophie and to Columbia for inviting me along for my afternoon, just as my day is ending. It's an honor to be here. But yeah, my first thoughts actually are not about Europe, it's about Asia. I want to pick up a couple of points before I delved into looking at Europe a bit more. Firstly, is to talk about the fact that, you know, Akosh talked about demand destruction that has happened and will continue to happen. I think that's quite there's two key takeaways in terms of the LNG market and then by extension the global gas market being so imbalanced at the moment. One is that the global gas market is lucky, quote unquote, lucky that China's had such a bad case of COVID this spring, and in fact that has been well timed from a European perspective. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind. But the unlucky element of all of this is when we look outside of Europe, and it is to kind of remind that this is a global gas crisis. This is not just a European gas crisis, and it certainly is ripping across the world, and in southern Asia is probably where it's most acutely being felt. We're seeing that effectively, you know, fuel poverty in places like Pakistan and Bangladesh, leading to social discontent. And if you think about, you know, I think most analysts perceived prior to COVID that this region in particular, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, would be a key driver of LNG growth during the early 2020s, and a lot of that being into sectors such as fertilizer. So if you think about the fact that in India, we're not seeing the growth in the fertilizer sector because of this, because the countries can't necessarily afford to import the LNG. And of course, then that ripples not only into an energy crisis, but also the food crisis. We've heard about the food crisis from the Russian-Ukraine war in terms of getting the grain out of Ukraine. Well, there is also a domestic one, well, not a domestic one, a Southern Asian one, which is that actually the you know, next year's harvest and the harvest stuff that are going to suffer as a result of the global gas crisis. So those are my initial thoughts in terms of demand destruction and the global ramifications. And yeah, and of course, I do tweet and post on LinkedIn horrendously far too often maybe regarding what's happening on the European front. And I think, you know, just to kind of bring some of those statistics that Akos highlighted. These are flows into Europe, and I apologise for to the American audience. I'm going to be quoting in metric numbers, but the numbers still, nevertheless, kind of highlight the orders of magnitude that we're talking about. So these are broadly flows around today. The major source of supply into Europe, and by Europe I mean the EU, including the UK and the kind of Western Balkan regions. LNG is the major source of supply, 375 million cubic meters or so arriving into the grid today. Or in recent days on a daily rate, 375. That's the key source of supply into Europe now. Russia used to be the big daddy, but that you'll see as I go down this pecking order. Next, Norwegian production. Actually, at the moment, Norway's suffering a little bit in terms of production issues, but still 300 million cubic meters of Norwegian domestic pipeline production. Oh, sorry, Norwegian production. Domestic production comes next. This is something that's in terminal decline in Europe, but it's still actually now made its way to third place in terms of pecking order. And this is where it gets particularly interesting. We're in the midst of this major outage on Nord Stream 1, which means that Russia actually falls below Algeria now. Algeria is supplying about 90 million cubic meters of gas into Europe, and then Russia comes in at about 80 million cubic meters per day at the moment during this outage period. So it's frightening to see from a security of supply perspective that this once dominant source of supply that the European continent has become so dependent upon is now so small, and that just highlights, you know, reinforces why those spot prices, why we saw TTF back near the levels that we were at the beginning of the war. Yeah, those proportions. That's Russia's gone from something like being 30-35% of the mix to being right now less than 10%. During the summer, we're probably going to be bobbing along at somewhere around, let's say 25%, assuming Nord Stream 1 comes back online. And of course, that is the big question, right? You know, there's a lot of concern. I think, you know, the idea that this is even a point of discussion, if you mention to someone in early February, you'd be in a situation where you're talking about, is it plausible that Gazprom would be cutting off customers because they're not switching to a new payment structure that's been imposed upon their long-term contracts, that we could be talking about Nord Stream 1 not coming online after a maintenance period, and such that the market share of this company has been diminished. And don't get the weird thing here is, you know, European Union is talking about weaning itself off Russian gas. The vast majority of this is not proactive Europeans. This is proactive Russia reducing flows. The element of weaning ourselves off in the form of demand disruption and leveraging LNG is playing a part. But, you know, aggressive counteractions by Gazprom is really the story of the day, and it's making everyone very, very nervous here in Europe. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Tom. I cannot agree more. I mean, you know, we have been looking at reducing these gas supplies of these gas imports from Russia, but in fact, it's Russia which is cutting Europe from its gas supplies right now. Leslie, what are your thoughts? You are looking at a lot of things, including the flows of LNG, which are, you know, going to different directions. How are you looking at the future, and what are your thoughts about the IEA report?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Columbia and Sophie, Akos, for having me. So I'll focus on the dynamic LNG trade, and let me focus on the dynamic part, because I think LNG has been very agile up to date since the crisis. And now that the war economy is sinking in, I see three big things happening. One is that Europe is going to survive this winter and survive from the worst of Russia's gas war, thanks to a surge in LNG imports, but also heavy demand destruction and a surge in coal. Second is that there is a growing role for energy diplomacy, and we don't know yet to which extent, you know, a few molecules are going to arrive in the next 2 years because of this big activity around energy diplomacy. And third is that Europe is paying a huge, heavy political and economic costs, huge sacrifices. And that will, you know, deepen the disunity in Europe. and more questions with the future role of Russian energy in Europe. So let me unpack a little bit those 3 points. So first, the surge in LNG imports. The International Energy Report is mentioning that the EU LNG imports will amount for about 120 BCM a year. So per year for the next few years, I think from 2022 to 2025. So it's about 88 million tons of LNG. And I'm wondering if it's not too conservative. Already imports in Europe have drastically increased. And so I understand the limitation. There is tightening of LNG supply. There is logistical constraint. More imports in the EU will put upward pressure on pricing. But we've seen that the flow of LNG has been very dynamic in the sense that Europe has been grabbing a lot of LNG from Asia and from emerging markets. And as we go into the winter, as we go into next year, I think more can flow also to Europe, regardless of what the amount of supply in the pool is. I think more supply will come to Europe potentially from other markets. But that's the big question mark is going to be China. And we have to look at China because China is basically influencing all trade flows because it's the only country that can absorb, has a huge absorption capacity. And if they absorb more, there is less for the rest of the global gas market. And looking at the difference between the first quarter of this year to the second quarter, we've seen that the big European Asian markets, so the largest, Japan, China, South Korea, they have freed 10 million tons of LNG, which is consequential. So what I'm looking for is whether we're going to see overcommitment from those big importers, demand destruction also, more fuel switching, and the weather, like is it going to be a mild winter or not? And fuel switching, we've seen that some companies, especially in Japan, have seen big profits by diverting their volumes that were dedicated to the home market to Europe because they make more money with high spot prices. So they are willing maybe to burn more coal or fuel oil to make more profit. So we'll have to watch that too. Second is the role of energy diplomacy, and I'm a political scientist by training, so I tend to think that we can expect more. I think a few more molecules will come to Europe from various countries that have not maxed out yet their exports. And the big question is, it's going to be transactional. I think that some countries are expecting Europe to make some gesture, and we'll potentially see more coming either by pipeline or by LNG. So the big question is how much influence European countries and the European Union will have. There could be some debottlenecking, there could be some producers going above nameplate capacity, some can limit flaring and free more gas for exports. I mean, there are a few options and we haven't seen that yet being put in place. And finally, I think that these big sacrifices that we see for European economies, potentially a recession in Germany, that there is room for growing disunity in the West. And, we're potentially going to see, as the war lasts, more countries questioning the role of Russian energy in the future. And yes, Gazprom can potentially keep 20% of EU gas demand by 2025. That's what the International Energy Agency is estimating. That's acceptable, I think, from a political point of view. The question is whether it's going to be acceptable from an economic and environmental perspective, because not having more Russian gas means more coal, and not having more Russian gas means, huge economic sacrifices. And I think all the German LNG moves that we're seeing are not set in stone. So yes, I think it was a big U-turn in Germany, but I'm just wondering for how long it will last. The FSRUs, they can be repositioned. The long-term contracts with portfolio suppliers can be diverted to Asia. So we'll have to see, but I still see an unknown for the future of Russian energy in terms of infrastructure. The pipeline are still there. And in terms of Gazprom's contracts with its largest importers, France, Germany, Italy, they are still all in place. So that's it for now.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for these very interesting comments. So again, for those who are watching us online, my name is Anne-Sophie Corbeau, and I'm here with Akos Schloss, energy analyst at the International Energy Agency, Tom Marzek-Menser, head of gas analytics at ICIS, and Leslie Pelty-Guzman, who is a co-founder and CEO of GasVista. So we are discussing the IEA's gas market report. We will now move into a moderated discussion, and we will open up to questions from the audience in a bit. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists, and I have seen that you have already started to do so at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So thank you very much for all of us for joining us. I think, first of all, when I'm looking at the forecast, I mean, there has been a bit downgrade in terms of demand, but we still have some demand growth in some specific regions. So Akos, I would like you to basically explain for 2022, but also for the next few years. So how has your demand forecast being reduced? And also, where do you still see some demand happening? And I will turn also to Tom and Leslie for specific comments as well.
Yeah, so I had one of these charts which showed the regional breakdown. Basically, the biggest hits were in Asia, where we see especially sharp reductions in demand, partly because of the weakness in China. That's only partially related to the price environment, more related to COVID and the economic slowdown there, but also due to the shortfalls that we have seen in South Asia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Tom already mentioned these countries which significantly curtail their LNG imports in particular. So Asia takes the biggest hit, and Europe is also obviously severely hit. That's part of the revision again is due to the milder weather than we had last year, but also about half of the revision comes from fuel switching and demand destruction, which is already happening in the industrial sector in particular. Now, where we still see growth is mainly the Middle East, which is less sensitive to global developments and global prices, and also North America, where we actually increased our forecast a little bit. That's partly because of the acute shortage of alternatives, coal in particular, and also the sharp ramp up that we are seeing for LNG exports and the associated feed gas demand that comes with it. So North America and Middle East are still some bright spots when it comes to demand this year. And then when we look at the global picture in a sort of more medium-term horizon, then of course I think in terms of Asia again is one of the most significant cuts. China we didn't reduce so much in the medium term because we think that the Chinese economy is becoming in a way more resilient to price spikes and volatility by signing a lot of long-term contracts in the last 18 months, mostly indexed to Henry Hub, and also by building out storage capacity quite an accelerated manner in the next 3 or 4 years. So they have a target of 55 to 60 BCM of storage capacity by 2025, and we see them meeting that capacity quite easily with already under construction facilities that are going to be finished on that time frame. So China was very modestly reduced, but we had to cut back India and emerging Asia in particular very strongly. So the projected growth rate compared to our previous year's forecast was cut by more than half in each of these sub markets in Asia. Of course, India is still growing because we think that to a much larger extent, their supply mix will rely on domestic production, which comes at a significantly lower cost than imported LNG. And in emerging Asia, this year we expect this whole sub-region to be flat, but overall in the next 4 years through 2025 to grow by only about 2%. We previously forecasted double that rate. We think that the underlying fundamentals are still there. A lot of additional power requirements and urbanization, cooling demand. These are still there, but of course the price environment is significantly more challenging, and many of these additional infrastructure projects, LNG to power schemes that have been previously planned will either be delayed or not materialize at all in this time frame. So in terms of Asia, the more significant cuts were made to our emerging regions, especially India and emerging Asia. Yeah, I'll stop there, and if you have any more regional questions, I can certainly cover those.
So maybe I can turn to Leslie first, because you mentioned China, and also we have seen China, contracting LNG like there is no tomorrow. They have been very strong. So how do you see this playing out for China in particular? We have seen a big drop, but looking short term, medium term, what are the expectations there?
So what has been very interesting with China is that they basically dropped their imports from the US to a huge extent, and to some extent from Australia also in the second quarter of this year. Their imports are down, I think, I don't know, like as you mentioned, but 20 to 30% so far in the first half. So it's very consequential, but they have increased their imports from Russia. So they are changing, their sources of imports, and we have to watch this carefully, especially what it means in terms of long-term trade risk for US LNG. And so far, Chinese US LNG imports have been highly volatile, depending on the trade war, bilateral relationship, economics. But since, as you mentioned, China has contracted the vast majority of all the recent long-term LNG contract with proposed US LNG projects, we have to look at what it means in the long term and whether those volumes will be diverted elsewhere.
And Tom, do you have any comment on, what you mentioned about Bangladesh and Pakistan? We are seeing, and Asia in general, we seem to see, gas being imported now by Europe, taken away from this Asian market. Is that basically coal coming back, and we may see, in fact, like really demand destruction in the long term in this region, which has always been seen as a fundamental growth market by pretty much all the forecasts? So are we going to destroy gas demand there long term, and in particular LNG demand?
I think that's quite plausible, because we have to think about this is not just an issue in terms of gas pricing for right now, it's gas scarcity right now. But if you look at the forward curves, this is expensive gas for basically until the Qatari megatrains turn up in sort of 2025, 2026. So the market is tight for a very long time, and that could really disincentivize a tranche of investment in terms of that we thought was going to be driving gas consumption within Southern Europe. I kind of wanted to pick up a little bit maybe on the China points as well. We're seeing both in the form of what's happening there in terms of, get this around the right way, gas to coal switching. So used to saying it the other way around, or it's still after a few months still saying it the wrong way around. Gas to coal switching, and that policy of coal to gas switching that the Chinese authorities introduced over the last sort of 5 or so years needs to remember that in the industrial sector. And I think there's a lot of assumptions that as the industrial sectors do that coal to gas switching, that it'd be a one-way street. So not in the case where you have, as it is in Europe, a fleet of power and a fleet of gas-fired generation, whereas as you switch your ceramics kiln from coal to gas, that switching back would be not possible. And I think actually the signs are that is possible, in the fact that the coal kilns were never closed, so to speak. So they stopped using them, but there is the industrial sector is being very price responsive within China. to what's going on. The final point I wanted to talk about was within the Chinese perspective is actually, of course, that the market. I think Akash, just for clarity, you've revised down your growth forecast, right? We still assume China to be growing in the coming years. It's not that we're now thinking it's not going to grow in gas consumption, but it's a downward revision of growth. And of course, you need to remember that the large proportion of Chinese gas demand is covered by Chinese gas production, and imports, be they in the form of pipe or LNG, are actually, let's say, 2/5 of what China consumes. But I definitely, think it's an interesting development that we're seeing CNPC really rely on Russian pipeline imports as much as possible. It's a small share, but they're clearly asking Russia to deliver as much as possible. Again, it's important to remember that Russian gas that goes to China is not the same Russian gas that goes to Europe. There's not that optionality, but the fields that do feed China are running at the top end of what they can do. Meaning that really China is not having to rely and lean on that the LNG spot market in any shape or form that we had expected, say just a few years ago.
Okay, I mean, I think that we have a lot of questions specifically on Europe. So, I mean, for example, Melidrios is asking whether we are not seeing any demand destruction in Europe in the forecast. And Mike Fullwood is pointing out that the Russian import base case, that you have, Akash, seems to be consistent with the contractual quantities. But in fact, the accelerated case would appear to reach the take-or-pay contract. Also, we have this kind of Damocles sword above our heads, which is if Nord Stream 1 is not coming back after the maintenance, which is ending on the 21st of July, we may end up with much lower gas supplies from Russia than we are currently seeing. And there is a pretty good questions also from Maria Pastukova on what are the implications of this ongoing crisis for the future competitiveness of the EU's industrial sector, which has now, until now, the German gas industry or the German industrial sector has been built on cheap Russian gas. So what is going to happen if there is no more cheap Russian gas, if all that LNG is coming to us? And also, to what extent, and this is, I think, a question from Eric Racou, are we going to see the solidarity agreements being tested this winter if there is not enough gas supplies to Europe? So starting with you, Akash, I know that I'm trying to throw a lot of questions to you guys. I know this is very complex, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a lot of questions to unpack, but maybe I'll address Mike's question about take-or-pay levels, which I think, if I want to put it very bluntly, we stopped looking at contractual obligations as a binding constraint anymore, because Gazprom has unilaterally violated those in the case of at least 6 companies so far, and if they for some reason stop flows on the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, then that's going to be another breach. So I think in this current geopolitical context, perhaps the take-or-pay levels should not be taken as a binding constraints anymore. Maybe there's going to be some legal resolution after the war, but for now, at least, it seems like other political and geopolitical considerations are driving flows, not necessarily the contractual quantities. And when it comes, sorry, I think there was a question about European demand destruction. I think we were seeing so far in the first half of the year, European. That's OECD European demand, which has great transparency and granular monthly information, was down by about 10% in the first half, and we see of course, half of this was due to the mild weather compared to the first half of last year, and half was reductions in industrial activity, industrial demand in particular. So, and we do expect this rate of declines to be sustained in the rest of the year. So, in a sense, if you take away the weather effect, we are already incorporating some additional demand destruction into our forecast. Now, of course, if Nord Stream flows do not come back at the level before the maintenance, that would remove about 11 to 12 additional BCMs from the supply mix. So I don't think we can find additional LNG. I think the LNG import capacity is pretty much already maxed out. The transit pipelines between Spain and continental Europe and the UK and continental Europe are pretty much maxed out. So if those volumes disappear from the market, then of course that would have to translate to additional demand reduction, rationing, and a combination of rationing and price-driven demand destruction, which would be significant. But so far we have incorporated a limited amount to the second half of the year.
Thank you very much. I mean, Tom, there are a lot of questions about, alternative supplies towards Europe. I mean, Azeri gas. I mean, any other alternative? We're also talking about EastMed. Is that, realistically possible? I mean, can we see more gas coming from North Africa? Actually, we have seen less gas coming from North Africa over the past few months. And also, what are the implications, I mean, of these very high gas prices on countries' policy? Because right now some of the consumers have been protected, but at some point this is going to cost a lot. So I mean, if gas prices keep rising because of the risk, what can we expect from the policymakers?
Again, quite a lot to unpack there. But so yeah, looking at alternative sources of supply in terms of non-LNG, maybe non-US LNG. The East Mediterranean region is an interesting one. I would say that we've seen, even before the policymakers came into play at a European level, we saw the Israelis and the Egyptians working together to increase Israeli production such that it can get its way into Egypt, such that it can be exported. And we've seen a little bit of that happening already, but in terms of a step change in volumes, I don't think there's a lot of opportunities there. Egypt consumes a lot of gas during the summer for its own air cooling purposes. From Azerbaijan, the TAP pipeline is pretty new, and it's relatively easy to upgrade to double its capacity from 10 to 20 BCMA. But I mean, even an easy upgrade of that caliber is still a multi-year task, and so that's. I think it's one of the statistics actually is a good hiding statistic. We talk about non-Russian pipe flows increasing this year versus last year, or TAP actually has been ramping up in the last 12 months. So just by virtue of hitting capacity, it is already allowed, in some senses, a non-Russian pipe to increase, with notwithstanding the Algerian decreases. I wanted to come back to the point that Akos made right at the start of his response, and the take or pay point as well. I think he mentioned, Akos mentioned there are 6 companies that have effectively, been cut because they didn't switch to rubles. We've also got Uniper and ENI, the 2 single largest customers that Gazprom have, receiving now since for the last month, something like only 40-50% of their nominations, and that's dropped even lower in the last few days with NS1 offline. So the concept of, I totally back what you're saying, the concept of using contractual LTCs as a floor in terms of what flows could or should be is now completely out of the window.
And it shows also that accommodating Russia didn't work, and that Russia will certainly, continue to weaponize the gas.
And this is exactly, I mean, what we may be also looking at from an LNG perspective, because right now, I mean, we have only been looking at the pipeline gas being reduced, but they're also talking about an LNG for ruble scheme for unfriendly countries on the LNG side. So, I mean, Leslie, do you see, I mean, what are your thoughts about that? How would that basically affect the flows? And I know you focus a lot on LNG. So, I mean, do you see potentially less gas coming from Russia, less LNG coming from Russia? What would be the implications for that?
So in summertime, there is less LNG coming to Europe anyway, because Yamal LNG cargoes are moving through the North Sea route. And most of the cargoes that have left so far have been heading to China. And I mean, there are 5 still on the route, but with our AI maritime predictive platform, Leviathan, that's what we see. And so 75% is still heading to Europe. So for now, you know, Europe can't be worried, but so far 75% is good enough. The question is whether when the route is closing again, whether those cargoes will still flow at a regular rate. And so, you know, it's interesting because far are gone the days when Europe was discussing a potential embargo on Russian LNG, because right now Russian LNG is indispensable in Europe. And even if, but at the same time, there is still some re-exports of Yamal LNG outside Europe. So, you know, it's going to be interesting to see when the mandatory storage rules are kicking in and all the utilities need to refill the storage, whether they will stop those re-exports this winter or not, and whether the policymaker will do something about it.
And you know, there was also a question from Alison Cartwright about you know, the emerging markets which are being basically priced out because the LNG is too expensive. So besides Pakistan and Bangladesh, are there potentially more countries which are at risk of not being able to afford LNG?
So Turkey saw a huge drop in the second quarter of this year. But other countries have managed to remain stable, and those are the ones. So most of the emerging countries have withdrawn from the spot market, but some with long-term contracts have, you know, stick to their long-term contracts, and we're happy to have those long-term contracts in place. Also, the countries that have high level of gas penetration already are more likely to keep their LNG imports, as well as the ones that have been able to pass through their costs on their end consumers. So a country like Thailand, for example, has managed more or less to remain stable in terms of LNG imports.
India is a big one. So in certain sectors in India, especially refining power and chemicals, spot LNG imports basically dropped to near zero. So it's also another country which in certain key sectors of the economy, LNG has become unaffordable. And you know, you mentioned this level of security that term contracts provide, but Pakistan is an interesting case in that regard, because in the last 12 months or so, they had at least a dozen you know, term cargoes cancelled by various suppliers, and that of course has very bad optics, very bad for the reputation of LNG. I think they signed these contracts at a pretty low price and consequently with pretty low penalties associated with cargo cancellations. So in the case of Pakistan, at least, we have seen not just spot cargoes not being avoided or not being taken from the market, but actually term contracted volumes being cancelled and redirected to European market.
Absolutely, and this is definitely something that the Pakistanis have not been happy at all about. I mean, there are still so many questions that are being asked, and I would like to thank, you know, all these people who have joined us today. Unfortunately, we have to close this absolutely fantastic event. I mean, I think we need to do that again in 3 months when the next report from the IEA is out. So I would like to thank again our speakers for joining us today, and thanks also to our audience for tuning in. I mean, you guys were great. Thank you so much for all the questions. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy's website in a few days. And for a full calendar of the upcoming events, you can visit the Centers on Global Energy's policies online. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day for those who are based on that side of the Atlantic with us in New York. And we look forward to seeing you very soon. Thank you so much, very much. And just for those who are looking at where our website is, it's www.energypolicy.columbia.edu. Thank you very much again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.